And you are speeding.
We rolling?
You're rolling.
All right. Hey, this is for Oklahoma's greatest Maoist, Jeff J. Brown. The commentator on China. Very happy to help out. Always happy to, because Jeff is such a great guy, such a great comrade, such a great writer. You got to check out his stuff, and I'm thrilled and honored that he selected this two-part series for me to read. Perhaps I'll point out that Breitbart picked up on this, and they criticized it. And they didn't really criticize it. They just said, this is what Press TV, this is what Iran is saying about the election. And it's funny because they didn't really critique it at all. They didn't, say where I was wrong. They just sort of passed on, 8 or 9, quotes. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Breitbart, for the free publicity. And it's interesting that half of their hundreds of commenters, because Breitbart, for people who don't know, is the website most associated with Steve Bannon. It's a very right-wing website, so it's totally fine for me to get criticized by them. But half of their commenters said it's basically, to paraphrase, it's so unfortunate that it's the guy that Iran sends to cover the elections understands the elections better than our own top-paid journalists. And I think that's, I'm not trying to flatter myself, I think that says more about how bad the journalism here is in the United States. And I think a big part of that is, what this two-part series is all about, which is the duopoly. Duopoly is kind of what it's all about. I mean, if they could just have a third party here, the Republicans and Democrats, they would instantly lose power, some power. They would instantly be forced to actually live up to their campaign promises. They'd have to, they would instantly be changed by, the presence of anything else. It's the world's oldest duopoly, and it's totally, stultified and calcified and all that bad stuff. So without further ado, I don't want to bore you guys too much. We will get to it. So this article was called, "The Results Are In, Americans Lose, Duopoly Wins, Trumpism Wasn't a Cult of Personality." So, this was just something that I was certainly very, very busy with Press TV, covering the news as a, daily news journalist. So, doing so many, on-the-ground interviews, talking to people, doing TV reports every day. And it's sort of a different point of view, I mean, I'm just your basic hack reporter. And I think that gives a different point of view than what, so many great analysts can give. We do kind of two different things. I mean, this is a analysis, but it's also informed by, the man on the street that I talk to. And very often this person on the street is so much more intelligent than the person in the think tank, than the professor, than the politician. So, I think I come from a sort of a different perspective, and it has its pluses and it certainly has its minuses. But let's go ahead with it. So, again, this is on day 3. Results are in, Americans lose, duopoly wins, Trumpism wasn't a cult of personality. So, here we go. It's day 3 of the US election debacle, and as we're still mid-debacle, it's very possible that Donald Trump will be the only conservative casualty, because it's already certain the US election was an undeniable disaster for Democrats. The Democrats had everything on their side in 2020. The mainstream media, the deep state, the self-proclaimed moral high ground, more campaign money than ever, a hysterically motivated base. And yet, if Trump does end up winning, Democrats will have nothing to show for all that. And here we are, I can just break here, it's November 20th, and they are, people are proclaiming Biden to be the winner, but we will have to see. So, going back to the failure of the blue wave, that should be stunning news, because here is the roundup of the non-presidential elections. Republicans now hold 60% of state legislatures, where the most far-reaching policies are decided in this extremely decentralized, pioneer-influenced system. half of all state governorships. They'll almost certainly keep a majority in the Senate. They shockingly reduced the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives. Conservatives just got a 6-3 majority in the Supreme Court. At the local judicial level, American judges are already so conservative that it's infamously said that they never see corruption. In the United States, corruption, much like propaganda, is something only found in other countries, of course. So if Democratic leadership, dominated by the Clintonista faction, is not corrupt, then they surely are incompetent. Despite every cultural, political, and financial advantage, truly an unprecedented situation, they might walk away with only decapitating the figurehead of Trumpism. It's the second consecutive enormous failure by whoever is planning Democratic Party strategy. They now have 2 black eyes, even if they oust Trump. That's good news for the Sandinista faction, but their blacklist of Iranian media shows how fake leftist they really are. Sidebar, that refers to an article I put out just before the election. The Democratic Socialists of America refused to talk to Iranian media. It's not really surprising because they're not really a third party. They are a faction of the Democratic Party which is committed to reforming the Democratic Party. You know, I don't expect Democrats or Republicans to speak with us, you know, to talk to Iranian media. But it just really shows you how sort of fake leftist they are, and how really inauthentic they are, in that they're not reflecting the American value of free press and free speech, which the Democrats and the Republicans don't either. Getting back to it, the American Commentariat is admitting the major Democratic defeat. This is just 3 days after, of course. You know, they admitted it right away. But it's being currently obscured by the presidential vote debacle, which is so far turning out like we all expected. Judges will decide and not voters. The U.S., it must be remembered, has always been a lawyer-dominated system. That is what rule of law really means in the West. Domination by aristocratic lawyers as opposed to worker domination, God domination, vanguard party domination, elder domination, and all the other available options. The outsider Trump threatened this domination, and thus the U.S. political elite seemingly did all they could to ensure that the presidential vote would be disputed in order to ensure control by this societal sector, lawyers, which they mostly came from, control and rewrite at will. So a subhead here, kill a snake's head and the snake dies, but 70+ million Trump voters are not snakes, but humans. Putting aside the uncertain fate of Trump himself, the 2020 election results already objectively insist that the main failure of Democrats was due to their insistence that Trumpism was merely a cult of personality. This allowed them to not seriously evaluate the true Democratic electability of their policies, personalities, principles, and job performance. They refused to admit that Trump incarnated actual political ideas and that he genuinely reflected some authentic cultural ideas and trends. By failing to understand that Trumpism was a democratic force which must be accounted for, the electoral reckoning was emphatically anti-democratic party in spite of their unprecedented advantages. The Democrats chose to rely on sensationalistic fear-mongering. Trumpism was based on white supremacy. White militias are about to shoot up Main Street. Oh, really? I think they failed to understand that both of these hysterical assertions were always going to be easily provable no later than November 4, 2020. So Trump's increased 2020 vote totals in black and Latino communities, they are white supremacists too? Sidebar, we now know that Trump got a larger share of the minority vote, the second most of any Republican candidate in 44 years. We also know now that 26% of all Trump voters were minorities. So basically, anybody who says that Trumpism is a white supremacist idea, what they're saying is that one out of every 4 Trump voters is a non-white white supremacist. Totally absurd. And we go back to that. So it's provable no later than November 4th, 2020. So Trump's increased 2020 vote totals in black and Latino communities, they are white supremacists too? Of course not. There's something deeper than what Democrats claim. Since Election Day, American cities are mostly ghost towns. Maybe 1,000 anti-Trumpers marched in Chicago. Even smaller numbers of pro-Trumpers rallied at voting booths. But the mainstream media warned for months that semi-automatic fire was actually going to be seen beyond the governmentally abandoned African-American ghetto for the first time ever. So where is it? Even on November 20th, where is it? This was always absurd, stupid, lazy, hysterical thinking, and it was exactly like what they did in France to their yellow vests, whom I covered more than probably any other reporter working in either English or French. Accusing these movements of white supremacism and anti-Semitism was always a way to discredit and ultimately suppress the political analyses of the lower classes, and especially of those whom Americans descriptively call white trash. But Trump supporters are not all white, nor does their poverty or lack of a vastly overrated college degree make them human trash. French Arabs supported the yellow vests as much as any other Frenchman. Sadly, this is all something the corporate media cannot allow to be said openly, so there is widespread misunderstanding of both movements. We must ask, why is that? The answer lies in the domination of democratic structures in the West by their 1%. The backbone of the Western system is not lower middle class mullahs, nor cobblers turned parliamentarians in Cuba, nor a Communist Party whose acceptance rate is on par with the American Ivy League of universities. The backbone of the Western system is exactly like Shah-era Iran, a tiny coterie of a few dozen rich families, and then a small percentage of the population who are handed some of the wealth and stability produced by the toil of the nation's masses in exchange for defending the few dozen gangster families. It really is the same thing. And the backbone is also something else, which, like propaganda and corruption, is never discussed in the US mainstream: duopoly. But this is the subject for part 2. Let's wrap up the reality of Trumpism's victory, even amid a possible defeat by Trump. So wrapping it up here. Many of the newly elected Republicans are widely called Trumpian. This does not mean they are parading around with guilt-framed pictures of the Donald, but that they have adopted many of his policies, such as, not white supremacism, but anti-globalization, anti-censorship, economic patriotism, sovereignty, and, crucially for the world, a reluctance for more endless imperialist wars. The adjective Trumpian the adjective Trumpian does imply negative policies, a hard line on immigration, a sinful and useless arrogance that America is the greatest country in the history of mankind. That is a direct quote. You hear it all the time in public over here. And a red scare-like hysteria against the socialist-inspired ideas of a strong central government and economic redistribution. This is a little parenthetical sidebar within this article. What's so telling about the US is that the word socialism is never uttered by their alleged left wing. Even the Bernie Sanders-linked Democratic Socialists of America are so timid and so propagandized that they absurdly and incorrectly added the adjective democratic in front of socialism. Socialism in the United States is a word only heard when hysterically screamed by the right wing. And it is hysterically screamed by them all the time, I can report. Very often on the one place where the Christian conservatives are relegated to in US media, which is AM radio, talk radio. But the election confirms that Trumpism is an ideology and not merely a one-time cult of personality. Trump the man is unpleasant, to be polite, but that personal judgment is far, far less relevant than the cultural, political ideas it is now clear that he, for better or for worse, genuinely reflected and clearly fostered. My point here is not to condone nor condemn these cultural political ideas. I am merely saying there are genuine ideas here which are authentically championed by a very large part of the US public. It is bad journalism to ignore this and scream white supremacism. But the US media and chattering class is another huge election night loser, along with the Democratic Party. Both were totally wrong about a non-existent blue wave and the denial of Trump's grassroots appeal. Their only hope is Trump loses and they keep chattering uselessly about that to deflect attention from that submerged part of the iceberg which they got all wrong journalistically. All I can say as a journalist is, you get it wrong, you get demoted. You lose your twice weekly editorial spot. You are no longer on the editorial board, etc. Back to the street for you. At least ideally, that's how it should work in journalism. Will there be consequences for getting it wrong for the failed Democratic elite or the US mainstream media? They have merited such reproachful dismissiveness that I'll direct towards them only what I think is the laziest journalistic phrase: it remains to be seen. That's the end of part one. It remains to be seen. It's the most useless. I just can't stand that phrase. You just hear it all the time. It remains to be seen what's going to happen. Yes, we all know. We do not have a crystal ball. Certainly us hack journalists. Part two. All right. It addresses how Trumpism related to the world's most powerful and longest running duopoly. So to get into my head here, it was, day 3, and we all should have known that even if Trump had only won 25–30%, and all the polls said that he was going to win much more than that, it was clear that Trumpism by day 3, it's here to stay. And like I said earlier, I don't condone or condemn it. I'm just trying to be a good hard news journalist. And all analysts, good analysts, are trying to be hard news too. But this is daily hard news stuff. This mentality, guys, it's all over. You thought you were going to get this repudiation of Trumpism. You absolutely didn't, and many people saw that coming. Because 25% is still a huge minority. 35% is an enormous minority. What they have now, it turns out, is 46, 47, 48, 49, maybe even 50%. Of the electoral votes, we will see, but they've got 47, 48%. So we have to start taking it seriously. So that's kind of what part 2, it goes into. For Americans who believe that their system is actually capable of reform, it would be nice if Trumpism was merely a cult of personality. But the 2020 non-presidential election results prove it truly is more than that. I think non-Americans grasp this, even if many Americans do not, as they are so effectively propagandized by an intensely corrupt Washington elite and their media sycophants. That last declaration was my attempt to sum up the true motivation of roughly 50% of the American population. Trump was elected by addressing not white supremacists who feel they have lost out in a new world they are, it is derisively implied, too stupid to compete in, but by addressing those who feel scammed and disgusted by the decisions of the political and cultural elite over the past 30 years. There's a huge, huge national problem when such a feeling motivates half a nation inside the polling booth, no? And the biggest problem is something Press TV tried to address in our coverage of the election from the start. And this is really, sidebar, this is really what, I'm telling you exactly what Press TV told me to do. Address listen to third parties. The biggest problem is something Press TV tried to address in our coverage of the election from the start, the refusal of the world's oldest and strongest duopoly to allow third-party alternative voices to be heard, much less have some political or cultural power. The duopoly will never enact the one change which would immediately improve American political culture for the better, ending their hugely divisive winner-take-all, first-past-the-post system. Far more than their electoral college, this explains the intense division and animosity over here. So I just want to say again, it's the winner-take-all system that is so terrible, and that relates to the duopoly. The only one or the other has a real chance duopoly means roughly 50% of Americans will soon feel that their vote was worthless, their presidential vote, which it will be. And not just their presidential vote. But moving to a coalition-type system would instantly mean a reduction in the power and privileges of the duopoly, which is why the duopoly so shamelessly enacts obstacles for third parties, that it renders the U.S. election system not free nor fair. Democracy with American characteristics. in the 21st century means a never-ending duopoly, where citizens go to boarded-up polling places on streets emptied of civilians, but full of security forces, as if they are going to war and not just to vote like a normal person. That's the way it was here in Chicago. It was completely dead. You really, it was really like a Twilight Zone episode, that you're going to vote, but there's nobody out there, and it's all boarded up, and there was more cops on the streets than, you almost ever saw. It was like going to war. Because Trump posed a threat to the duopoly, they and their 1% allies absolutely freaked out in 2016 and spent 4 years throwing everything they had at him to boot him out by any means necessary. The cost was absolutely enormous on a cultural level. Trump used and joined the duopoly. Trumpism inherently resisted. Part 1 described the basic ideology of Trumpism, but to recap, not mere white supremacism, but anti-globalism, pro-national sovereignty, anti-censorship, and anti-foreign wars, but also being hysterically anti-government and anti-social safety net. As Jeff added here, totally true, the usual echoes of libertarian Tea Party ideology. Absolutely, Jeff. But more time was spent relating how the mainstream media's so-called blue wave, part 1, more time was spent, was relating how the blue wave was a huge failure. It's like American conservatives fended off the Tet offensive. Trump the man seems on course to lose, even on November 20th today, yet Trumpism helped the so-called Trumpian Republicans sweep to dominance. Call it the flatworm phenomenon. Democrats may succeed in chopping off the head, but the body will undoubtedly live. Election results prove. That's what you can do with flatworms. You can cut off their head and they will still grow back. Mother Nature is a mad scientist, but do realize that we are examining a phenomenon which exists in the world's most effective duopoly. What has been verified this week is that the Republican swamp has so very effectively absorbed the blow of Trumpism, which should have been enough to create a new third party. It's unfortunate, only in the US, This will allow the Republican elite and establishment to eventually dilute and soften Trumpism, rather than giving America a truly new start and somewhat revolutionary clean break. This is how extremely effective the duopoly is when confronted with any grassroots movement. The only winners in the American duopoly are the richest 1%, of course, never a grassroots anything. Sidebar, this is all based on the idea that Trumpism doesn't become a new third party. It does not seem that way. The Republican side of the duopoly did this with the post-Great Recession Tea Party, and they have long co-opted libertarian ideas while still keeping that party perpetually under the key 5% vote mark. But neither ever had the widespread appeal of Donald Trump. On the other side, this absorption allows the other side of the duopoly to not be shaken by the end of the duopoly. A Trump presidential loss will mean the Clintonista faction, the far right of the Democratic Party, which has ruled since 1992, the end of the Soviet Union, it gives them cover to not make any changes either. They lost everything else, but they beat Trump. They can crow about this endlessly as the duopoly controls the media here. So the greatest domestic significance of a loss by Trump the man is a victory of the duopoly. Personally, I find a victory for the duopoly nothing to celebrate. I think Trumpers may not voice these views specifically with great regularity, but these analyses would be accepted by them. However, even pro-Trump forces are nominally pro-duopoly in their essential conservatism. Trumpism is not revolutionary. I am not asserting that. But I am asserting that it is fundamentally anti-duopoly without really knowing it, because duopoly is so rarely spoken aloud here. Because Trumpism is so very much anti-Washington swamp corruption. Of course, Trump himself is not Lenin. Trump has not the intellectual capacity nor the ideological rigor to form a new party. Trump the man has no ideology except I'm the best. I'm the best. I'm the greatest. It's the most fantastic. You have to listen to my Trump impression. I'm in America. You have to have a Trump impression here. I'm sorry, Jeff. Jeff, your site is the greatest. It's unbelievable. It's just top notch. It's fabulous. Gold toilets. But you have to put up with my Trump impression. I will get back to business. This is Jeff J. Brown, the greatest Maoist that Oklahoma has ever produced. They've only produced 4, maybe 5. They're all very good, but Jeff J. Brown is the best. All right, so Trump the man has no ideology except I am the best. But that doesn't mean his followers are all pure narcissists as well. This is another reason a Trumpist third party did not emerge to stop the duopoly's destruction of their charismatic, essentially apolitical leader. Trump changed his party affiliation 5 times. If anything, he fits in another duopoly-suppressed category of American voter, the independent. We must remember that the Republican half of the duopoly resisted Trump until as late as possible. It was not until May of 2016 when he was voted in via the grassroots Republican primaries. That was when the Republican establishment finally had to accept him. But that's the party's elite. 2020's widespread victories of Trumpian Republicans proves that Trumpism won despite an unprecedented 4-year mobilization of the massive forces of the 1% and the duopoly. Trump might have been able to take on the duopoly, but not in one term. Trump might have been able to take on the duopoly in 2016, but the most common thing I've heard from pro-Trumpers is that they didn't let him drain the swamp. And that's true. From the immediate Department of Justice's veritable entrapment of his original national security advisor, Michael Flynn, they dropped the original charges. It's basically entrapment. To a Mueller report, which did not even indict, much less convict, a single American on charges of election conspiracy or collusion, to a 3-year Russophobia campaign, to a totally partisan impeachment campaign. I could go on and on. Trump spent 4 years obstructed and hobbled by nonsense. Of course, Trump was obstructed by his own nonsense, his desire to be loved by all, and that included a duopoly which hates him, and his lack of any real political ideology beyond narcissism. That is why Trump was always a mere figurehead. If Trump finagles a second term, the widespread hope in America and beyond is that he would finally ignore the duopoly's efforts and really do something which breaks from 30 years of Washington's anti-99%er corruption. But back in 2016, despite his undeniably immense appeal, the U.S. duopoly was so strong that Trump simply could not have been elected without joining one of them. He used the duopoly and has rather significantly transformed both sides. The Republican elite hated him and then merely tolerated him, but Trump had astoundingly high approval ratings among Republican Party members, and they have responded. Trumpism has changed the Republican Party at the grassroots. That's what the election proves. The non-presidential vote election proves. The short-term vision of future America must include this new reality, but also combine it with the Democratic Party's near total 2020 failure, which makes them now hobbled to achieve much needed and much wanted improvements in the social safety net, healthcare, the environment, etc., and etc. The Democrats will shift to the right yet again. As I wrote, the duopoly's rabid anti-Trumpism has cost this country's 99% a great deal, sadly. I'm not writing in favor of Trumpism nor in condemnation of it. I'm trying to do something rare, give objective journalism about America in November 2020. Trumpism was, like the Yellow Vests, slandered and distorted because it reflected the political ideas of so-called white trash. But class analysis insists that they are not trash, and good reporting of the election results prove that a racial analysis is woefully inadequate as usual. You can dislike it all you want, but Trumpism is obviously a genuine, authentic movement, and 2020 confirms it was even a successful one. But we should expect that the duopoly swamp has done what it always does, swallow up, dilute, and suck out any of the ideas which could create actual reforms to the nation's aristocratic, privilege-protecting, 18th century-based, hysterically evangelical, capitalist imperialist duopoly. It's hard for me to say, yay, Trumpism, but it's also hard to say, yay, the duopoly survived Trump. The latter is what the global corporate media is insisting we do, but certainly many Trumpers are going to be inflamed that the duopoly combined its forces to defeat their candidate at only one level, the chief executive. This feeling will only increase as long as people continue to arrogantly demonize Trumpism and refuse to look at this political movement with logic, dispassion, and a feeling of patriotism, or even human warmth. The only thing I will absolutely promise is that the cultural division wreaked to suppress Trumpism will continue to have hugely debilitating and polarizing domestic effects for the rest of this decade. And I conclude here. If Trump loses, the American duopoly stands. Shakier than in recent memory, yes, but it stands. I think many Trumpers understood that, and that helps explain their vote. But rabid anti-Trumpers are too propagandized to allow Trump to continue his insolent and inherent questioning of the integrity of the U.S. system. So that's the two-part series, you know. Here we are, 17 days later. What do I think of what I wrote? Maybe people are interested. You know, I think that here we are, and I think, you know, it was part one was totally just hard news reporting. The blue wave totally failed. The repudiation of Trumpism totally failed. We have to accept that. So I think part one was pretty much hard news. I think part two, you know, it really, you know, it showed how Trumpism fits in the political system, which is a duopoly. And, you know, that's something that you don't really hear about because they never talk about a duopoly. What's so interesting about the U.S., you know, I'm trying to give you something new here on November 20th, is that it's just so deeply polarized. I mean, this country is, you have, and you know, my coverage has been accurate this whole time. It's a nation of two presidents. Trump has not conceded. He has self-declared. Biden did exactly what he said he wouldn't do in the first debate, which was declare until the vote was certified. He backtracked on that, and he self-declared. And it's a hugely divisive thing. And at Press TV, that was, I think, our first report. You know, we had a lot of unrest in 2009. The so-called Green Revolution was caused by what the moderate candidate declaring early. And that's exactly what happened over here. That's exactly what Biden did. And we're still here. So, I don't know. I'm not answering my question. Jeff, you should maybe cut this out, but I'll wrap it up. What do I think about what I wrote? Well, obviously, I like it. I wrote it, and I think it holds up. I'm very biased in my favor, I should point out. We can just talk about the duopoly all day. And I have a vote here in America. And I voted third party every place that I could. I would vote for every party short of a far right party. A true, you know, here in Chicago, to quote the famous movie, The Blues Brothers, the Illinois Nazi Party. I'm not going to vote for them. But everybody else I'm happy to vote for because the duopoly here is so strong and it forces such division. Combined with this winner-take-all system, the lack of a proportional system, the duopoly is just, you know, there has to be a third party here, or there has to be a change to the U.S. system. I think it's much easier to have a revolution because the duopoly is inscribed in the U.S. Constitution. That's the way that they wanted it. So I think we're going to have to wrap it up here. I have to get back to work. We're doing a story today. What's the story? You know, it's a TV, hard news daily report. It is new poll out, Monmouth College. They're huge pollers in the United States. They're a very well-known polling institution. 80% of the country believes that this country is divided on fundamental values. Even though this country is 250 years old, even though there is no serious external threat, even though this is the richest country in the world. Why are we so divided? I think part of it comes back to the duopoly, the lack of a proportional system, and the winner-take-all system, the lack of a proportional system. The only way to change these things, that's up to you. You know, one way is certainly to vote anti-duopoly. Thank you very much. Please keep coming back to Jeff J. Brown's site. Please buy his books. They are fantastic. Jeff changed the title. It's the New Red Book on China, formerly China is Communist, Damn It. It's a book I was waiting decades to find. It's a hugely important piece of political thought. So please support him and support me too. I need support too. Thank you very much. All the best to you.